Hello, my name is Priscilla Dowden White, and I'm Associate Professor in the History Department at the University of Missouri St. Louis, where I specialize in African American and U.S. history. Well, that's a very important question, and it brings to mind two things for us to consider. First, we need to look at the decisions and the choices that people in the past made in their particular historical context. And that requires this careful study of the choices and decisions, the circumstances surrounding them as they made those choices and decisions. It requires that we look at the constraints that they had before them, not only their circumstances, but also the alternatives that they had before them. And second, I think reconciling the past requires us to acknowledge that there are connections between past and present. There are linkages between past and present. While we are not hostage to the past, while we are not controlled by the decisions, the choices that people in the past made, we are influenced by them. We are connected to those decisions and choices because they, in some cases, laid a foundation on which we are still building and still striving. In some cases, they created some problems that we are still struggling with how to fix. So both acknowledging and paying particular attention to the context in which people in the past were operating, and also acknowledging and paying attention to the connections between those decisions and choices and those that we have to make today, I think are very important. So we have to be careful not to impose the present onto the past, not to impose our current sensibilities and understandings on the past. We also find great value in looking at the challenges that were before some of the more prominent, well-known historical figures that we study, but also those challenges that everyday people faced. And this question actually ties back into our first question. When we look at, for example, the fact that for nearly 250 years, the United States legally practiced slavery. And today, it's safe to say that we look at slavery as a moral evil. And therefore, it's a challenge for us to look at slavery existing for nearly 250 years in this nation and not to just demonize people and totally cancel them without looking at their challenges, their decisions, their circumstances. And we need to acknowledge that the practice of slavery was a question. There was a choice whether or not the United States would practice slavery. and the United States made the choice to practice slavery. And so we have a right then to look very carefully at the choice before them, how slavery therefore came into existence, why those who were in power, who had the authority to make that decision, how they were able to come to that decision. We also have the right, and as students of history, we should ask hard questions of those individuals who and those institutions that made those decisions, that made those choices, and look carefully at how they came to be. So one individual that I really enjoy studying is Thomas Jefferson, because he gives us an opportunity to look at what we're talking about here, not only in the context of his time, but also he gives us an opportunity to look at how we have come to the decisions and the choices that we have currently made. So Thomas Jefferson is arguably the most articulate voice of freedom and equality in American history. At the same time, he owned approximately 600 slaves throughout his slaveholding career. This is, of course, a contradiction. And we need to look at how Thomas Jefferson and others in that society attempted to reconcile that contradiction. We know that in terms of looking at the legitimacy justifying slavery, that some even used biblical scripture to justify the morality of slavery, the legitimacy of the morality of slavery. We know that while slavery was legal for nearly 250 years, slavery was challenged during those 250 years. So we can't look back at that period and say, oh, well, it was okay for the United States to be a slaveholding society because it was legal, and many people didn't have a problem with the morality of it. Well, many people resisted slavery, and many people fought against slavery. So when we look at the resistance on the part of those who were enslaved, those Africans, those African Americans who were enslaved, when we look at their struggle to free themselves, when we look at the abolitionist history, we can see that slavery was in fact challenged. And so it's legitimate for us to raise questions about the legitimacy and the morality of slavery. When we consider where we are today, one of the things that I think is important for us to acknowledge is that today we still struggle with greed in our society, which was, when we ask the question of why slavery, we can't get around the fact that greed was a motivation, was the primary motivation for slavery. And so when we look at how greed interacts, how it undermines the ideal of freedom and equality during the period of slavery. We also have to ask questions about how greed may undermine our current struggles for equality and freedom in our society today. Well, one thing that I like to do is to focus on the lives of ordinary people. And one of the assignments that I sometimes give my students is to interview family members. And by interviewing family members, it not only deepens, makes more meaningful the history that students are studying. It really brings it to life. And it helps students to understand that history is not just about dates and names and even events, but when they see that some of the people that they have interviewed and people in their families sometimes actually may have participated in some way, or at least have been alive and experienced on some level the history that they're studying. This helps to deepen, to broaden the historical narrative. I also think that we need to take advantage of current events. And today we are experiencing so many current events that serve to give students an opportunity to look at the meaning of history and an opportunity to broaden the historical narrative, as you say. So I'm thinking about how just now, Juneteenth has become a federal holiday. And of course, before this happened, there were a number of Americans that did not even know what Juneteenth was. And many African Americans have been celebrating Juneteenth since the 19th century. And so this is an opportunity for us, by looking at Juneteenth as a way to look into the past. It's a way for us to acknowledge, yes, this is a holiday that commemorates the end of slavery. But why Juneteenth? Why aren't we simply commemorating the Emancipation Proclamation? Why aren't we simply commemorating the 13th Amendment, which officially ended slavery? What is this? How does this Juneteenth complicate the narrative for us? Why were there slaves in Galveston, Texas, for example, who did not know that they were free? How does this help us to give more meaning, more understanding to this complex institution of slavery and the process of ending it?